Good evening. My name is Phyllis Evans, and I'd like to welcome you all to the Lincoln Presidential Foundation's final installment of the speaker series, Warning Signs, Lincoln's Response to Rising Threats to Freedom, Justice, and Democracy, which we launched earlier this fall. This project, made possible with generous support from Iron Mountain, is both history and a call to action for all citizens to be engaged in the responsibilities we each have in self-government. The project includes an array of new resources, including a companion docuseries, all available now on our website at lincolnpresidential.org. Tonight, we will be premiering part 3, Taking a Stand, followed by a discussion featuring Dr. Silvana Siddali. Before we begin our program this evening, I'd like to thank each of you for joining us. Today is Giving Tuesday, and the Lincoln Presidential Foundation is shining a spotlight on the Lincoln Home National Historic Site. We are proud to partner with the National Park Service, and thanks to generous people like you, we have funded important landscape projects, educational outreach, community events, and the creation of a new exhibit for youth. If you'd like to support Giving Tuesday and the Lincoln Home, then please visit our website at lincolnpresidential.org. I'd also like to remind you that following tonight's presentation, we will entertain your questions for Dr. Siddali in order to streamline the process and hopefully allow us to get even more questions to our tonight's speaker. Please submit your questions through the Q&A function. And now, the premiere of the film, part 3 of Warning Signs, Lincoln's Response to Rising Tensions in the 1850s.
In 1854, there's another one of these fragments, these little incomplete documents where he says, okay, you want to justify slavery. What do you think will make it all right for you to enslave a fellow human being? Oh, because their skin is darker than yours. Well, my skin's darker than yours. Are you going to enslave me? Because you think they're not as intelligent? He says, all right, well, lots of people are smarter than others. Does that mean they have a right to enslave those people? And finally, he gets to something that I think is deeply important to Lincoln throughout his life, which is this idea that might does not make right. He says, oh, because you're more powerful, that's why you're going to enslave this person? Well, you better be careful, because someone more powerful may come along and enslave you.
After serving in the state legislature for 4 straight terms in 1834 through 1842, Lincoln eventually decided to get involved in national politics. He found out that he was really good at politics.
In the 1850s, Lincoln wanted to be elected to the U.S. Senate. And in 1858, he seemed to have his best shot. And he was up against Stephen Douglas, the little giant of Illinois. And Douglas is the most powerful Democrat in the Senate in the 1850s, and Lincoln is going to challenge him for that seat. Now, Lincoln was not as big of a name as Douglas. He needed Douglas, in a sense, to gain traction for his own campaign.
Lincoln's original plan was to follow Douglas everywhere, and he said, hey, wait, why don't we just make this a regular gig? Let's just spend the rest of 1858 having debates. And Douglas wasn't going to do that. He says, hey, Lincoln, if you stop following me around, I will agree to a formal debate with you in the remaining congressional districts, which are 7.
And in the fall of 1858, these two men tour Illinois. Lincoln, in a much more modest way than Douglas. Douglas is riding around with a lot of pomp and fanfare on trains with bands.
The second debate is a really important one. It was held in Freeport, Illinois, and what's been known as the Freeport Doctrine. In the first debate in Ottawa, Illinois, Douglas posed 7 questions to Lincoln to basically make Lincoln look like an abolitionist. Lincoln in Freeport says to Douglas, you're this really smart guy. You asked me 7 questions that I've answered. I've only come up with 4. He asks Douglas, you keep saying we Republicans are revolutionary for resisting the Dred Scott opinion. We don't resist it, but we disagree with it. You've been treating Supreme Court opinions as if they are a thus saith the Lord, but you also are a champion of popular sovereignty. What's it gonna be, Douglas? What's more important, a Supreme Court opinion? Is that the supreme law of the land? Or can it be overturned and ignored by a local law passed by a territory. Douglas's future is on the line here because he knows if he says popular sovereignty, it'll tube his chances with the South. But if he says, no, Dred Scott's more important, his signature policy is into the trash can. What does Douglas do? He puts his eggs in the popular sovereignty basket. It's at that point in 1858 that Southerners start demanding a federal slave code for slavery in the territories.
Many people believe that Lincoln won those debates, but he was not then made a senator. That was up to the state legislature, and they selected Douglas.
In touring the state with Douglas, Lincoln begins to make a real national name for himself. Readers of newspapers around the Midwest and around the country are going to read excerpts or even whole accounts of the LincolnDouglas debates. And they know who Stephen Douglas is. Now they're beginning to learn who Abraham Lincoln is as well.
There are points in his development as a politician where he could have backed off, he could have said something not quite as gutsy, but he takes an ethical stance. Yes, he's a politician, and he's a great politician, and he will pull his punches. Yet in the House Divided speech, he's actually coming right out and saying, those people are trying to spread slavery everywhere. It forces people to recognize that there is a choice between good and evil. There's a choice between slavery and freedom. There's a choice between putting slavery on a path to extinction or spreading it everywhere. That half measures really are not going to work anymore. It's either going to become all slavery or all free. This can't go on this way. And although he doesn't come right out and explain that there should be freedom everywhere, he does say something that in the ears of, say, more moderate 19th century Republicans would have sounded controversial, which is that, yeah, eventually slavery will be put on a path to extinction. That is radical, and it takes courage sometimes for politicians to come out and take an ethical stance when they are worried that they're going to lose power or they're not going to be elected. And this is Lincoln's great chance to reach the national stage. As a senator from Illinois, he will have a lot of influence. So the fact that he was willing to come right out and take a moral stance is admirable.
Greetings, everyone, and thank you again for joining us for tonight's screening and speaker program for Warning Signs, Lincoln's Response to Rising Tensions in the 1850s. I'm Erin Carlson Mask, the CEO of the Lincoln Presidential Foundation. We're so appreciative of Iron Mountain for their foresight and support of this project as part of their Journey to Equal Rights initiative. Part of what prompted our creation of this docuseries, the companion curriculum, and these interactive webinars was a desire to respond more fully to public interest in this time period, the events leading up to the Civil War. Plenty of comparisons and contrasts between that time and our own have been made time and time again. What happened then, and what was the context? How did those events shape our reality today? What questions should we be asking about that time and of our own? As we've said previously, the work of history, gathering evidence to develop an understanding of what was and what is, asking thoughtful questions, those are all at the heart of civic education and civic engagement today. So we're delighted to be able to spend this time with you to talk through these ideas and this history. We're delighted to be joined by Dr. Silvana Siddali, who is Professor of History at St. Louis University in St. Louis, Missouri. Dr. Siddali's research focus is 19th century American political and constitutional history, particularly in Midwest states, including Missouri. Her books include Frontier Democracy, Constitutional Conventions in the Old Northwest, published by Cambridge University Press in 2015, and From Property to Person, Slavery and the Confiscation Acts from 1861 to 1862, published by LSU Press in 2005. She also edited Missouri's War, the Civil War and Documents, published by Ohio University Press in 2009. She has also written a number of essays, articles, and chapters, including the piece with a title I just had to share with you all, Regulating the Jackals of the Monetary World, Banking and Constitutional Reform in the Antebellum Northwest, published in the Western Historical Quarterly. She has also received a number of awards and distinguished fellowships, including an award from the Missouri Humanities Council for Distinguished Achievement in Literature in 2011. Silvana, it's great to have you with us today.
Thank you. It's an honor.
You opened part 3 of this series by talking about a fragment of Lincoln's writing. So this is not a finished piece, not a published piece, but something where he's working through specific arguments. There are many ways one can debate a point. He was certainly familiar with the moral arguments against slavery. During his presidency, for example, he noted, quote, "I am naturally anti-slavery. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel," end quote. That's an argument about right versus wrong, feeling that something is immoral. That's not the argument he's making in this fragment, though. He's employing this classical logical argument. What was the purpose of that approach, and did he ever employ it publicly?
Oh, he employed it publicly all the time. This was someone who loved a good story, and even in the most difficult moments, people would say to him, ask him some question or other, and he'd say, "Well, that reminds me of a little story." And sometimes these little stories didn't have a point, or were perhaps not even relevant to the point that was being made. But it was his way of lightening the conversation and getting to people to think about images, the color of the skin and the power that someone has. Those are images with which people were familiar and that would have meant something to them. The moral arguments against slavery wouldn't have persuaded some people. And he knew that. And what he was trying to do here was to say, nothing that you're saying here stacks up. It doesn't make sense. You're not convincing me that it's right for me to enslave someone, and you should be concerned that someone could make these arguments and enslave you. Now, granted, a fearful argument like that, I shouldn't do this so that someone can't do it, won't do it to me, isn't a moral argument. It's not an ethical argument, but it is something. It's a way in for Lincoln. These stories, these images, they were a way in. They were a wedge to let him get in there and make an argument that people might find persuasive.
How do these arguments he's making, these classical arguments, reflect his own self-education, if you will? He was a student of some of the classics for sure.
Yeah.
See how he's employing some of those arguments here. How does that relate to his own education?
Well, he's a self-educated man. He's a self-made man. And so we should say that right away. He had an endless store of stories. But among the books that we know he read as a young man was Euclid. And he loved the Euclidean, the beauty and the order of Euclidean logic. It was something that was deeply meaningful to him. And I think that, especially as a lawyer, his arguments honed very closely, if you look at them in many of his cases, very closely to common law precedent, to constitutional arguments, and always to logic. If this, then that. If you can't have this, then you certainly can't have that. And there are some cases actually that he argued in Illinois in the 1850s that made that point very clearly. There was a young woman who was being sold as a slave, and he made the point that, well, she's been buying things in a store. How can she be a slave if she can make decisions and pledge her credit? Anyone who can pledge her credit can't possibly be owned by another human being. That there again, perhaps you wouldn't class that as a moral or ethical argument, but it is an argument whose logic is inescapable in a larger sense.
That's good. You also note in that opening that he makes this essential argument time and again that might doesn't make right. How does this argument relate to his understanding of the American experiment in self-governance?
Well, it's the last best hope of Earth. It's that beautiful phrase that the mystic chords of memory spanning from every patriot grave. It's this idea that underneath it all Americans share a common bond. And for him, he's in that phrase in his inaugural address, he's talking about the common bond of the revolutionary heritage. But he sees it as something much bigger than that, the common bond of, a commitment to the rule of law, a commitment to the Constitution, and a commitment to freedom.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if I have just answered your question.
Yeah, you absolutely did. Yeah.
Okay.
So, I mean, it contrasts this experiment in government of self-governance in the United States at that time with and the uniqueness of it in terms of global political systems at that time too. So I think that's very helpful. In this episode of the docuseries, we also dig into the debates between, at the time, the relatively well-known Stephen Douglas and the relatively lesser-known Abraham Lincoln. What were the primary differences between what they were advocating and presenting to the voting public?
Well, and they really were talking to the voting public. They weren't precisely talking to the state legislature, who was, going to make the decision. Perhaps my students always ask me this. Well, why were they arguing then? Why were they debating if they couldn't really influence the outcome of the election? Well, perhaps they were hoping that more people would vote for their party rather than the other party. But I also think Lincoln, as shrewd as he was, and he was a brilliant politician, that he knew this would put him on the national stage. He was aware that these debates would be widely publicized and that they'd show up in a lot of newspapers and then from there get copied onto other newspapers. But you asked me about the differences. A lot of that depends on which set of debates you read. The farther north you go, the more free Lincoln is to voice his criticisms of slavery and to criticize particularly the doctrine of popular sovereignty. The farther south you go in Illinois, he pulls his punches more. And, it is never in doubt that he's appalled by Stephen A. Douglas's moral squishiness. That's never in doubt. That's pretty clear through all the speeches he makes.
So I'd like to pull on that thread a little bit because you talk in the series about Lincoln making statements in debates that were gutsy. That's the word that you used. I love that word. And the transcripts of the Lincoln-Douglas debates can be disappointing and offensive, to put it mildly, for students of all ages today. And I'm sure that your students have brought this up in particular with you. Can you put those debates into context for us? In your experience, what is the most important thing to understand about them? And what's most often misunderstood about those debates?
Well, I should say, I think I made the comment. I believe we were talking about the House divided speech at that point, maybe. Yeah.
Oh, right. That could be. Yeah.
Yeah. It's so hard for us to understand that mindset now. We don't live in the same world. And I think questions about Lincoln's attitudes toward race are important and they must be asked. And the answers are difficult and complicated and as you say, disappointing sometimes. He is a man of his time. I will say this, he evolved a great deal. The man he was in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s changed drastically. I think within a year or two of his arrival in DC, and it changed for good. So Guelzo's excellent book on the Emancipation Proclamation, which I would recommend to everyone. He makes that point that Lincoln starts thinking about emancipation in 1861. And Frederick Douglass, who, nobody could accuse of ever pulling his punches. I mean, he was not a squishy moderate at all. But he does sort of say, well, there are times when I wish Lincoln had moved along a little faster. But he met Lincoln in the White House. And he says, you know what? He treated me exactly the way he treated everyone else. And he perceived no difference in Lincoln's attitude toward him. And that to me is indicative of Lincoln growing and changing and becoming more, getting a bigger point of view about race than he had before he left on that trip to Washington.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So you are based in St. Louis. You've done a lot of research on Missouri, including this time period in particular, and that preceding it and during the Civil War and afterwards. The Dred Scott case, of course, is linked to Missouri before heading to the Supreme Court. Did Missourians take note of what Douglas and Lincoln were debating? Because clearly Douglas and Lincoln were well aware of what was happening in Missouri. Were Missourians taking note of the content of their debates, especially considering Douglas, and everyone knew that, had national ambitions, and you could argue that people were figuring that out about Abraham Lincoln. So what was the response or reaction in Missouri, if any?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, I do think, you don't see much reaction until the speeches start getting clipped from Illinois and other newspapers, and they appear in Missouri newspapers. And now Missouri, during the Civil War, St. Louis was kind of a Republican stronghold. I mean, the city was sharply divided like every place else. But so what you see in the Republican newspapers in St. Louis is more, they're very enthusiastic. Interestingly enough, especially the German newspapers, they love these speeches. But no, when you get farther outside the city toward the west, especially in the Northwest, what today we call Little Dixie, the counties along the Missouri River, no, they hate Lincoln's guts. But they're not interested.
I guess it's to be expected. So this series as a whole deals a lot with the compromises that are embedded in the U.S. Constitution, in Congress's legislative actions, including the Missouri Compromise.
Yep.
That's what's happening at the national level. But we're really fortunate to have you here with us this evening because of all of your work looking at state constitutions and what's happening at the state level. In your book, Frontier Democracy, Constitutional Conventions in the Old Northwest, you analyze the fierce and complex debates that are taking place over state constitutions from the 1820s through the 1850s, including those for Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Ohio, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan.
Right.
What were the main issues being debated in those state constitutions?
Well, these were territories trying to come in to the Union as states, and they, they had to set up their governing infrastructure. They had to put their states on the map, so to speak. So the core ideas play out on a constitutional landscape, meaning they don't have much choice. It has to be a bicameral, tripartite constitution with checks and balances, and they always include a bill, especially by the 1850s, they include a Bill of Rights. They're very worried about representation, how people will vote, how do you become a citizen of the state. They're deeply concerned about the rights of African Americans and trying to keep Black people out of the states. There are always a few people who are, kind of wild-eyed radicals who actually think free Black people should have the right to vote and the right to own property. So those debates get really interesting. They start talking about married women's property rights. And some of the other debates they're worried about, of course, the finances, because these states, I'm looking at state constitutions both from the territorial stage as well as what happens when they have to revise their governments, because they're all going broke. They've pledged way too much of their credit for all these, these sky in the pie or pie in the sky. Is that the expression?
Yep.
Projects, and they're trying to figure out a way to rescue their economies. So they're like all other human beings, I guess, worried about their families, about their prosperity, about their rights. And, and it's a foreshadowing of how people will talk about the rights of people who have migrated into their states and who are just trying to establish communities and profitable farms, but who may not be white. So those debates are lively, and some of them actually become violent. Some of these guys punch each other out. They call each other out on duels, which is frowned upon. They call each other names. So, politics was, unlike today, was quite divisive and
How did, can you speak a little bit more about how those debates over representation and citizenship play out? I mean, do they tend to land in more uniform ways, or do some of these states manage to achieve a little bit more on behalf of this, aspirational vision outlined in the Declaration of Independence?
Oh, no. None of the states, I mean, Wisconsin got closer than any other state to granting suffrage to African Americans, but even they couldn't quite make it work. In none of the states was there any, people fought very hard for it. They really did. And African American opinion leaders and community leaders would go to the conventions sometimes and plead with people. There were tens of thousands of petition signatures. Clergy would come to the conventions or speak to the delegates privately, but no, none of these states in their early history were willing to grant suffrage rights to African Americans. And some of them even tried to pass constitutional provisions that would forbid Black people even from moving into the state.
Mm-hmm.
So no, it's going to take another 150 years for all of this to be resolved, at least on paper.
You mentioned the sort of long-term time period for resolution. You also mentioned fiscal consequences for the states. Were there other long-term consequences of the decisions being made? And were there any? Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd leave it there. What are the other long-term consequences to equality?
Well,
and to state fiscal health?
That's a big question, but I can tell you one thing that I think is really interesting. So after the Civil War, the Reconstruction Amendments put an end to human bondage, try to guarantee civil rights to freed slaves, and then protect voting rights. And there were lots of in all of the Midwestern states, one of the things that you see is an unwillingness to do this until the federal government actually launches these constitutional amendments. And to me, this proves that you needed a national solution to the problem of discrimination and segregation and racial oppression. You needed a national, constitutional, federal solution to that. It was not going to happen in the states because a lot of these northern free states see the Reconstruction Amendments as being a way to punish the South and to ensure that the Democratic Party would not rise again. They didn't think, oh, you mean us? Oh, we have to do this too. So yeah, so that's why I think that's why it's such an interesting story in the Midwest, especially in the state constitutions in the 1870s. That part's not in the book. It's a piece I'm working on now.
Interesting. What role did the creation of new states in the Western territories play in this national conflict between slave states and free states and the national debate about slavery's expansion into territories?
Yeah, well, with every new state that wants to come in, you get it's almost like a family dispute, everything that comes in, every new problem, every new member of the family, every new move or whatever, I'm torturing this metaphor, but it all brings up the arguments again and the fights again, and none of the compromises could ever really solve anything for good. And why? Really? Why? Because fundamentally there's a moral and an ethical question about human freedom that was never really fully addressed. And the Reconstruction Amendments tried to do that. And it's a fundamental constitutional question. Should all human beings be free? Should all human beings have equal rights, be equal before the law? And so the Reconstruction Amendments, that's why I say what plays out in the Midwest and in any new state coming into the Union is such a huge problem that it required, in the end, not a political solution, but a national reckoning. And really, Abraham Lincoln would have said it was a reckoning with the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights.
Can you speak a little bit more about that? Because you mentioned that in, I think it's the fourth episode of the series, where you talk about the biblical reference that he makes to.
Oh yeah, in the apple of gold in a frame of silver. It's from Proverbs. Yeah, I don't have that in front of me right now.
That's okay, but the idea being, you're talking about sort of and he, as president, certainly takes an oath to uphold the U.S. Constitution, but at the same time considers the Declaration of Independence this, aspirational, this vision for the direction of the country. So how did he balance those two things? Because one is a very, legal framework that he's bound to uphold, and certainly that he's advocating working within, even, through the LincolnDouglas debates, he's not talking about sort of burning everything to the ground, but rather working within that framework. But at the same time, he's arguing that the founders had these certain ideas. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, for Lincoln, the Declaration of Independence was one of our constitutional foundational documents. If you look at early 19th century school books, the kinds of school books that Lincoln and probably, as far as we know, Mary Todd also would have read, what you see is Washington's farewell address, the Declaration of Independence, the United States Constitution, and maybe one or two other documents. Interestingly enough, you don't always see the Bill of Rights. But that tells me that people like Lincoln and 19th century, early to mid 19th century Americans would have thought of the Declaration of Independence as a fundamental document that the Constitution was meant to frame. The Constitution was meant to put that into action. And I do understand that this is a controversial view. It was something that Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, actually really disputed, and he was very angry about the idea of the Declaration of Independence. I don't remember precisely what he said about it, but he repudiated it. For that reason, all men are created equal. Oh no, they're not.
Yeah, yeah. In your book, Missouri's War, the Civil War and Documents, you include information on the sectional conflicts that preceded the Civil War. So going back to this issue of not just state or territorial, but sectional and regional, can you talk a little bit more about those conflicts and how those relate to the political issues happening during this 1850s period?
Well, I can say that when Missouri's delegate presents his credentials as a territorial delegate, a non-voting territorial delegate, and he's part of that debate over whether Missouri should come in as a slave state or a free state. During that debate, as that is all heating up, there are senators from some of the southern states that say, if Missouri comes in as a free state, we'll secede. There will be a civil war. And the phrase civil war is in those speeches. I'm talking about as early as 1819. So that to me is a sign that the conversation is already breaking down. When usually when you make an ultimatum to somebody, you've already lost. Everybody's already lost. An ultimatum is. And I am not answering your question at all, am I? This is very exciting, and I'm all over the place. I'm sorry.
No, it's good.
Yeah, but as I said earlier, every new state that wants to come in raises that. And of course, as you know, each state then following Missouri's precedent, has to come in with, each new free state has to come in with a slave state. So to keep the balance. And it, after a while, it becomes absurd. And this dividing line between North and South had to have been so damaging to the national spirit.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't alive during that time, but it was an arena. Now we have divisions. We have terrible divisions that I wish so much we didn't have, but at least they're not entirely geographic. I mean, if you can't break the country apart. But in those days, I often wonder about the Mason-Dixon line and the Missouri Compromise line, whether that didn't kind of put the country on a path to an inevitable. Perhaps, I don't want to say that the Civil War was inevitable, but maybe that was psychologically, maybe people thought, well, we're already sort of divided.
Mm-hmm. Well, and much of the debate seems to, a lot of the debate was over who is a citizen and who is not, who has certain protections guaranteed and who does not, who has power and who does not. And you've done considerable research and writing on the experience of free and enslaved African Americans before the war, including in Missouri. Can you tell us about those findings, specifically regarding the experience of free and enslaved African Americans in these debates?
Well, the best source for that is the Black Convention movement. And there's a great website that has all of this stuff digitized now. Just Google Black Convention movement. Beginning really, and I think the first one occurred in Michigan in the early 1820s, and they go right through the Civil War into the later 19th century. Free Black people gathered in political conventions. They usually were held inside states, so they were statewide, and they made powerful arguments both against slavery and for equal rights. And I consider those conventions to be parallel constitutional conventions.
Mhm.
Because they
Mhm.
often happened at the same time, especially, well, just in the states that I've researched, they often happen in the same time, and often even in the same place or very close to the place where the state constitutional conventions are happening. They're very much aware that, their lives depend on state constitutions protecting their property and protecting their rights. So, so they come up with resolutions, and then they, will either deliver those resolutions to state legislatures or to state constitutional conventions, or even just having them published in newspapers. And that, to me, they're not, I don't want to call them shadow conventions, because that would be unfair to what they were trying to do, but they are almost a parallel political and constitutional movement.
Mhm. Not an uncommon strategy for those trying to elevate their position and try to gain more attention for their causes. So
Yeah.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Two final questions before we turn to the audience questions. You have, I know, a particular affinity for some of those fragments of Lincoln's writings, the pieces that show us how his mind is working through something before he makes it ready for political consumption. Are there any other fragments that you think are particularly important for folks to know about?
Well, my favorite one is the one I mentioned, the apple of gold. The apple of gold in a frame of silver. This concept, and I don't have it. Well, it's on my computer, and I'm talking. So I don't have it memorized verbatim. But the Constitution, he says, is like a frame of silver around an apple of gold. The apple of gold is to me, the bedrock, the foundation of liberty and equality. And the Constitution, the Constitution is what frames that, what gives it force, what gives it life. Mm-hmm. That is my favorite Lincoln fragment. There are other ones, that little bits and pieces that were found in his papers, and we don't precisely know when he said those things. There's another one on slavery, on how if slavery is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. He says that in a letter to someone, and that's kind of his bottom line. But he's also written similar things in other little scraps of paper.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And lastly, from your perspective as an historian, what is your key takeaway about what Lincoln did during the 1850s and how it relates to our role as citizens today?
Oh. Well, okay. He's a constitutional lawyer. He knows the Constitution. He knows how to put over an excellent winning argument. And during that time, the 1850s, is when he was building himself as a politician. He is a self-made man in so many ways. He's someone who actually builds his instrument. And I'm going to mix my metaphors here. I was going to say brick by brick, but you don't bring it. Anyway, his instrument is his voice, his presence, his thoughts, his beliefs. Nothing that Lincoln ever says in a political speech actually is, it always has that core kernel of an ethos. And when I say voice, I don't mean his actual speaking voice, which by all accounts wasn't that impressive. But his voice as a human being, and he isn't a terribly ambitious man. But one of his friends said that Lincoln's ambition was a little engine that knew no rest. So I think that's what he's doing in the 1850s. He's quite well known in Springfield, and he's done a lot for his state, moving the capital and lots of other things that he was interested in. But in the 1850s, Lincoln, before the foundation of the Republican Party, Lincoln was a true Whig, somebody who believed in building the nation and in connecting people and regions and states.
Do you think we need more of that today?
Pardon?
Do you think we need more of that today?
Yeah, what we need more of today is an ethical and moral voice in politics.
Well
That's
said.
all I'll say on that subject.
Well said. Well said. So our first question comes from Melvin, and he asks how Lincoln would feel about political debates today. And Melvin, I'm not sure if you meant the actual structure of debates, which were very different than what they were during Lincoln's time, or about the content. So Silvana, I'll leave it up to you to answer that either or both ways.
Well, Lincoln was really good at telling colorful stories, and some of them got pretty blue. And that's probably what he'd probably tell a rude story about it. Because modern debates, the modern political debates, I find actually really deeply interesting, and I love listening to them. And I think Lincoln would have held his own. I mean, this was a man who wrote his own speeches, and he didn't rely on talking points or sound bites or tweets or any of those little nuggets of nothingness that people, put out in the atmosphere. He would have, he would have been very well prepared. And if he had an opponent who was not well prepared or not suitable, he would have made mincemeat of him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Greg notes, as a native of slave state Kentucky with slave-owning relatives who supported the Confederacy, how did Mary Lincoln view slavery and race relations, and what was her influence on her husband's related positions?
She was another one who grew and changed quite a bit. She became, over time, a loyal Unionist. And I have actually never seen anything that indicated that she held on to her early beliefs. In fact, her lifelong friendship and deep reliance on Elizabeth Keckley, who was herself enslaved early in her life, that tells me that Mary, she was able to overcome these beliefs.
Yeah. Question 3 comes from Christine, and there's a comment that precedes it. She says to you that this is all wonderful and will be a great resource for students and teachers in the classroom. And she wanted to ask you a bit about the clip in Lincoln's Fragment. She says, it strikes me that his right doesn't make right argument is logical, but also pragmatic, perhaps resting on the idea that he recognized Northerners were self-interested.
Yeah.
She said, I was just teaching my students John Harris's The Last Slave Ship about the slave smugglers in the North and Northerners' investments in slavery throughout the 1850s and 1860s. She says, my students are struggling to understand how people could hold contradictory ideas about freedom and slavery and white supremacy and act in their own economic interest and do so all at the same time. Often they toss up their hands and just say people were hypocrites. My question to you is, how can we use Lincoln in his writings as a way into these conflicting and contradictory ideas that people held at the time? And Christine, we thank you so much for being a teacher and teaching others about this subject matter. So Silvana, how would you respond to that?
Oh, that's so difficult. And it's one of the things I agree. It's one of the things that's particularly hard in a classroom when, people say, but how could he say that? How could he do that? And you think, well, we're human. We all make mistakes. We all have our blind spots. And I can point them to a couple of things. One is that Lincoln himself changed and grew. He was always a person of compassion, but he himself changed his, he became aware that his earlier beliefs were limited and that they weren't accurate. It's really important in conversations like this not to get people to think, well, this isn't nice. You shouldn't believe this because it isn't nice. it's not accurate. It's not accurate to think that some human beings are in any way inferior to some other. We're all carbon-based life forms. There's no logic to thinking that some of us are, lesser or more. But so that's one thing. And the other thing I ask my students about sometimes is, what do you do? What do you do when you have a conflicting point of view? How do you arrive at something that makes sense for you and that you feel is morally right, and that you can, a point of view that you can stand up for, something that you believe in, that you won't be ashamed to admit. And, you can work your way through it. If that answers.
Yeah, I think it does. And there's also the issue of what is sort of morally right, and then what is legal, what you're legally bound to. And I think that that's one of the interesting things about Lincoln once he has taken an oath of office. You were mentioning Frederick Douglass earlier, and he has a very important role as an activist pushing for a cause that he believes is right, but he's not bound by the same constitutional constrictions, perhaps, that Abraham Lincoln is. I've seen this come up in some of my, where I worked previously. We had a program called Students Opposing Slavery. And one of the things we had the students do was the slavery footprint. And it looked at how in the global supply chain, certain decisions we make that might be in our own self-interest, Christine, actually relate to unfair labor conditions, and that it is very important to be an informed consumer and an informed citizen to make sure that you are minimizing or eliminating that kind of impact when possible, but that it is also true to the point that you and your students are making, that a lot of people are making decisions that are in their own self-interest or their family's self-interest. You even see that on Lincoln's own cabinet, Silvana, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, with cabinet members who come from slave-owning families, and when they're debating the Emancipation Proclamation at the cabinet level during his presidency, those issues to some extent are coming out, or at least in the background, if nothing else.
Yeah, but Lincoln had to hear those viewpoints in order to understand how the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation would be received. It was tricky because, recruitment was flagging in the Union Army at that point, and he didn't want to interfere with that, and or at least put any obstacles in front of it. So he understood one thing that we have to remember is we're in the middle of a civil war. We lose that war, these people will never be free.
Right.
Or at least, you'd end up with a situation like South African apartheid. That above all else, that had to win that war.
Claire notes, I appreciate the list of foundational documents you gave that Americans would have read growing up in the early years of the 19th century. How much credit does Lincoln deserve for elevating the centrality of the Declaration in our contemporary understanding of our national narrative?
What a great question. I am not sure. I'm not sure that people really do credit him. I think that he should be credited. And I think there were other politicians who were trying to make that point, but they were so radical that people weren't listening to them. Or at least nobody outside their immediate circle of co-believers. I'm thinking of people like Thaddeus Stevens and some of the other, John C. Fremont, who we shouldn't even talk about. But so there were other people who were making some of these arguments. But one of the things that Lincoln does when he's making these arguments is he always comes right down to the foundation. What's at the bottom of this? What is the unalterable truth? What is the single thing that can never be divided? And for him, it is this idea of human freedom.
Yeah.
And human rights too, I should say.
And human rights?
Yeah. 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 I've seen sometimes people talk about this as though it's just about liberty, but liberty without a conscience is, at best, it's anarchy. At worst, it's, it's really destructive.
Yeah.
So, but for Lincoln, the true goodness of the human soul always revolved around this idea that of freedom and equality, freedom and rights. Maybe not equality early in his career, but I would say freedom and rights.
Mm-hmm. Economic equality, perhaps, maybe not.
The equality of opportunity, the equality that there would be no artificial obstacles placed in your way because of the condition into which you were born.
Right. That's the open field, the fair chance. Thomas asks, I've just used Lincoln's Lyceum address of January 1838 with my high school students in St. Louis. To address, quote, approaching danger of mob violence, end quote, and the need for the rule of law. Can you offer any comments about this early speech, particularly its impact on politics in Illinois and Missouri? Thank you, Thomas, for teaching. Silvana?
Actually, he just said it much better than I could.
Really? Yeah. Well, what would it's interesting that you mentioned that document in particular, Thomas. The foundation is an Educating for American Democracy champion, and part of that cohort, and the Lyceum address comes up all the time. And we're talking about doing our next project centered on that. So Silvana, that address in particular, what is there anything for you that stands out about how that speech really relates to politics today?
Oh, no, boy, that's so difficult. I'm sorry. I'm drawing a blank. To politics today.
Well, I think maybe, and Thomas, you can add a clarifying point if that's helpful, but the idea of mob violence, the idea of also, when I think of the Lyceum address, I think of how Abraham Lincoln is talking about trust in political institutions and how to uphold those political institutions. And when that trust erodes and society breaks down into violence, what that leads to, and the fact that would tear apart this experiment. And so do you have any comments?
Lincoln, see, he's an old line Whig, and for him, politics isn't just a dirty game, which of course, he was able to play, but for him, and Whigs do believe in institutions, in governing institutions, and in this idea that you form certain fundamental agreements and you stick to them, and that merely becoming angry and flinging yourself outside of the framework, I guess I could say this. It comes back to his might doesn't make right argument. That what holds us together is reasonableness and virtue. It's kind of the old time classical republicanism argument, and that what provides at least a bulwark is these institutions that always check each other, that nobody's power should ever grow too much. And mob violence is the very antithesis of that.
Yeah. And Thomas did offer the clarification that he meant of that time. And so he's probably thinking in terms of the mob violence that was in fact occurring in Illinois and Missouri that Lincoln was taking note of. And then Bill offers one last comment that in the end, Lincoln was a man of his times, and in some ways ahead of his time, even in what he said or first thought doesn't fit with our current sensibilities. And he rightly points out that people 100 years from now will look back on this time and offer their own critiques on how we all are and were. So thank you all so much for your wonderful
As they
questions.
should.
Yeah, Silvana, thank you so much for spending this time with us, for your time in the series, and for your time answering all of our questions this evening. And we really appreciate it. Phyllis, back over to you.
Yes, Silvana, thank you so much for tonight's discussion on Lincoln's House Divided speech, as well as the obstacles he faced when challenging Stephen Douglas for the Senate, all while trying to make himself nationally known. So we're also grateful for our partnerships with Iron Mountain, which has allowed us to continue sharing this project with our members and donors online and through our Fourscore Speaker Series this fall. We will be taking a short break during holiday season, but please visit our website often at lincolnpresidential.org to watch for information on our upcoming webinars in January and February with authors Dr. Kate Masser on her book, Until Justice Be Done, and Dr. Mark Polad, excuse me if I said that incorrectly, but anyway, Dr. Mark Polad on the history of art and photography. As you close out tonight's webinar, you will see a short survey. Please take a moment to complete the survey as it helps us to improve our offerings to you and lets us know what you would like to see in the future. As always, we thank each of you for joining us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you all in 2023. Can't believe I'm saying that. Happy holidays and good night.